This is our third lecture on Hegel's Introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Having spelled out in sections 73 to 76 the problem of the justification of a modern science that comes on the scene and presents itself as inherently superior to other forms of knowing, but whose claims are neither self-justifying nor easily justified, and in sections 77 to 80, the generalization of this problem of justification in an investigation of the inherently teleological and supposedly necessary succession of different forms of knowing, Hegel, in the remaining sections of the introduction, sections 81 to 89, addresses the dialectical method by which this investigation into the justification of different forms of knowing is to be conducted. Or, as he says, the method of the way the phenomenological progression is carried out. There are two methodologically salient issues. The first of these is the problem of the criterion in sections 81 through 84. This concerns how a dialectical progression of different configurations of consciousness, of the sort Hegel imagines, can even get started. This is the topic of the present lecture. The second methodological issue and the topic of our next and final lecture on the introduction concerns the nature, once it's gotten off the ground, of that dialectical movement in sections 85 through 89. Specifically, the issue here is what a dialectical progression looks like to the natural consciousness undergoing or experiencing it, and what it looks like to the phenomenological investigator, and so specifically you, the reader, observing it or looking on. The four sections I have grouped under the heading The Problem of the Criterion are thematically subdivided as follows. In section 81, Hegel discusses the problem of the criterion 1. In section 82, he considers the abstract determinations of knowing. In section 83, he addresses the problem of the criterion 2. And in section 84, he arrives at his solution, the knowing of knowing. Once again, the titles are mine, but as you can see immediately, they are really two related problems of the criterion. The first of these, the problem of the criterion 1, is the problem that a given form of knowing simply does not seem to command a standard by which to measure the relative truth of something that lies outside or beyond that form of knowing. Without such a standard, it seems impossible to say which of a given set of forms of knowing is more advanced than which, and so which follows which on the path of natural consciousness. And that progression was, of course, to be the entire point of the phenomenology. But as we'll see, that way of putting the problem still remains somewhat ill-defined. The second, more developed formulation of the problem of the criterion 2, explains that even though in a system-to-system comparison we actually do command such standards, we here have more than one, and the decision between them inexorably leads into an infinite regress of standards, once again preventing an investigation of the natural path of consciousness, and so the phenomenology of spirit from getting underway because we'd never be able to settle on a method of how to go about it. Fortunately, Hegel shows that by familiarizing ourselves with what he calls the abstract determinations of knowing, we can see that in the case of the particular investigation at hand, in which knowing itself is both the subject and the object of knowing, there actually is a solution to the problems of the criterion. This solution forms the methodological backbone of the entire phenomenology, and that's why this stuff is important. Section 81. The problem of the criterion 1. In section 81, Hegel begins with an analysis of justification. He says, the investigation and testing of the reality of cognition seems incapable of taking place without some presupposition of which underlies it as a standard. To test the reality of cognition is to judge its truthfulness. But in order to judge or justify a claim, or to be certain that a claim about the world is true, we need a standard by which to assess its truth. Claims to truth are justified by appeal to an accepted standard or criterion of truth. The idea is pretty straightforward. If I claim that my iPhone is 6 inches by 3 inches, I need a standard measure or ruler, or else some other trusted source of the dimensions, which itself ultimately relies on a ruler, to establish the truth of that claim. And Hegel explains that in the resulting equality or inequality between the standard and what is tested lays the decision as to whether what is tested is correct or incorrect. Now, there's not much of a problem with that when it comes to measuring things within an established system, for example, within the imperial system of inches and feet or ounces and pounds. Although even here there are well-known problems of measurement. After all, someone still has to ascertain the resulting equality or inequality and make the decision about it. Things don't measure themselves. Although wait for Hegel's explanation of his method. But by and large, comparing things to each other within given systems of measurement is unproblematic. We get closer to Hegel's problem when we compare different systems of measurement with each other. But here too, there isn't much of a problem so long as we can translate the units of one system into those of the other. So long as we can then use either system equally well. There may be pragmatic, cultural, or even aesthetic considerations concerning which system we prefer, but there isn't much sense in asking which one is more real or more true. I mean, that hasn't stopped people from asking just that, as the "what the F is a kilometer" meme amply illustrates. But I digress. The real problem of the criterion emerges when we make A. Object to concept comparisons, specifically between mind independent objects and mind dependent conceptual truths, and ask whether the concept matches its object, or B. System to system comparisons and ask which one is more true. Both comparisons play a role in Hegel's investigation, as we'll soon see. We already encountered object to concept comparisons in sections 73 to 74 and will again in section 83. Still, in the Phenomenology, which is a comparison of successive forms of consciousness, Hegel principally addresses system to system comparisons. For instance, when comparing modern experimental science, as it first appears in the 16th and 17th centuries, with earlier non scientific forms of knowing. There seems to be no independent standard by which to compare these forms of knowing, and so by which to justify one as superior to the other. Hegel says, but here, at the point where science first comes on the scene, neither science itself, which here would be one type of system of knowing, nor anything else, in other words, no other system of knowing, has justified itself as the essence or as the in itself, in other words, as actual, genuine, true, and truth tracking knowing. And without something like that taking place, i.e., without such a justification, it seems that no examination, like the one promised in the Phenomenology, can take place at all. Now, the reason why neither has justified itself appears to be in the first place a problem of measurement, in the sense that there simply isn't a measure for such a thing. The first problem of the criterion appears to be that there's no external system transcendent standard to appeal to in order to justify the superiority of one system over another. I say appears to be because, yes, the problem writ large is the unavailability of a system transcendent standard, but as we will see in system to system comparisons, that unavailability doesn't mean the non existence of such a standard. In system to system comparisons, the problem is not that there are no standards, but that we can't find a way to agree on any. Section 82. The abstract determinations of knowing. In other words, this complaint about the absence of a standard still leaves the problem somewhat ill-defined. Why isn't there a standard? Couldn't science simply devise one? In fact, isn't the scientific method supposed to be that standard? As in, follow the method and you'll land in the truth. To answer these questions, Hegel in section 82 takes a step back and turns to what he calls the abstract determinations of knowing. He says, one can have a more determinate grasp of this contradiction and the removal of the contradiction if, first of all, one is reminded of the abstract determinations of knowing and truth as they come before consciousness. Note first that Hegel now calls the absence of a standard a contradiction. He doesn't explicitly say why, but presumably it has to do with the questions I just raised. It is intuitively clear that we can and do examine and compare different forms of knowing. I don't know about you, but that's why I go to the doctor and not to the faith healer when I'm sick. And yet, we seem to have arrived at a dead end where we are forced to think that because of the apparent absence of an independent standard, we cannot actually examine and compare different forms of knowing. We can examine and we cannot examine, a contradiction. And since the phenomenology is supposed to be just that examination, this contradiction needs to be resolved before Hegel can even get started. Note that, second, the abstract determinations of knowing were already touched upon, but largely left implicit in Hegel's observations about the relation between cognition and the absolute in section 73. The question for now is simply this: what is involved in, what are the discernible elements of, or the active moments in, knowing something, anything at all? The short answer is there's always something, a mind or an I or a consciousness or a subject, that puts itself in an epistemic relation to another thing. At least on the initial naive picture of this relation, the mind only stumbles across something out in the real world that was already there, undisturbed, in the first place. This makes knowing a posteriori. You have to come across the thing to know the thing, and if you don't come across it, you won't know it. It makes the relation somewhat accidental. You may or may not come across the thing, and it makes it metaphysically asymmetrical. The this object or thing is what it is independent of the mind's coming across and knowing it. It is in this sense essential or a being in itself. While this makes the mind inessential, the mind has some tricks of its own. Most notably, it turns that happily solitary and hermetic being in itself into an object of knowing or a being for another, namely for the mind. Moving on to section 83, the problem of the criterion 2. The cool thing is this: what happens when the object of knowledge is the relation of knowing itself? When the mind puts itself in a relation of knowing to knowing, which is, of course, just what the phenomenology of spirit proposes to do. Or, as Hegel puts it, if we then investigate the truth of knowing, it seems that we are investigating what knowing is in itself. Now, the detour in section 82 through the abstract determinations of knowing was to help to bring into clearer view and then help resolve what Hegel calls the contradiction generated by the absence of a standard of truth in system-to-system comparisons. And even though section 83 is short, it packs a punch because, armed with the results of section 82, it fills in some important blanks. So, first, as Hegel says, an investigation of the truth of knowing, or of what true knowing truly is an investigation of knowing as it is in itself. There is such a thing in the world as knowing. It has its own nature, or its own being as it is in itself. And that's the thing we want to get to know. But then, by the abstract determinations of knowing, we also know that, quote, in this investigation, knowing is our object. It is for us. And the in itself of knowing, which would result from the investigation, would be instead its being for us. So, knowing as an object, knowing as the object of our investigation, has the same kind of duality that affects all objects of knowledge, according to the abstract determinations of knowledge. They are both what they are independent of our investigating them, and they are known, if at all, only as objects of that investigation. They are both a hermetic absolute and a being for another. By the same token, knowing itself is what it is, but as object of our investigation, it is also only as it is for us. This would seem to have the immediate skeptical consequence concerning knowledge of the absolute or in itself that we already encountered in sections 73 and 74. It would appear that we can never know the true knowing as it is in itself, but that we can only ever know knowing as it is known to us. Quote, what we would assert to be its essence would instead not be its truth, but rather only our knowing of it. And he continues, the essence or the standard, that is to say, the standard or criterion of truth by which to judge whether we got it right, would lie within us. And that which was supposed to be compared with the standard, and that about which a decision was supposed to be made on the basis of this comparison, would not necessarily have to recognize that standard. So that's the classic problem of object-concept comparisons we encountered earlier in section 81 and in sections 73 and 4 before that, according to which we inevitably lack an objective or transcendent standard, a standard that's not just our own, by which to measure mind-independent objects, because all our standards are inherently and by definition our standards, and so mind-dependent. So this absence of a transcendent standard seems to be a direct consequence of the abstract determinations of knowing, even when applied to the case in which knowing is itself the object of knowing. But note a slight wrinkle or twist. Hegel says that the absolute here, or knowing as the object of our knowing, would not necessarily have to recognize our standard. Pause on that for a second, because that's the subtle shift that takes us beyond the object to concept comparisons of sections 73 to 4. After all, it'd be weird to say that an absolutely unknowable beyond would not necessarily have to recognize our standard. An absolutely unknowable, truly mind-independent beyond wouldn't give a hoot about our standards, wouldn't know of standards. There would be no question whether it would or could or should recognize our standards. But there is a question here. And the reason why there is now a question whether such a beyond would recognize our standard is, of course, that this beyond, or the being in itself, or the object we're investigating, is itself a form of knowing, with its own standard or criterion of truth. Moreover, since we are trying to come to know it, we are, among other things, trying to come to know and determine the truth of that standard or criterion of truth. In other words, we're now engaged in a system-to-system comparison. The problem here is not the first problem of the criterion, that there is no system-transcendent standard. There are two, at a minimum: the one of the knowing that investigates and the one of the knowing investigated. But the question, given this multiplicity of systems and standards, whether our standard would be recognized by the knowing we're examining, thus brings us to a second and arguably deeper version of the problem of the criterion. The system of knowing we are trying to come to know, including its standard of truth, can't be expected to recognize our own system's standard of truth. First of all, we're investigating it and not the other way around, and so there's no question of it recognizing us. Second, even if there were recognition in the sense of awareness, this doesn't mean it's recognition in the sense of acceptance. It's not conflict-free. To the contrary, the interaction of two systems of knowing, each with its own standard of truth, inevitably leads to a conflict between those standards, with each system insisting that its standard is the correct one. Now, presumably both can't be right. But to decide between those two standards, we then have to appeal to a third standard by which to assess those competing standards. This would be the standard of standards. This standard of standards, however, will not be recognized either by either party, unless it too can justify itself. But the justification of the standard of standards would, of course, itself require a standard, as all justifications do. You see where this is going. Whatever that standard for the standard of standards might be, it too is not self-justifying and so would require yet another standard, and so on to infinity. In short, our two problems of the criterion are these. The first derives from philosophical object-to-concept comparisons, such as between an absolute beyond and our attempts to conceptualize it. It's the problem that we have no mind-independent access to the world, and so no mind-independent way of telling whether our mind-dependent concepts get it right. In the case of system-to-system comparisons, that problem actually does not arise because knowing is never a complete beyond to knowing. The knowing doing the investigating and the knowing being investigated both have their standards of truth, and adjudication between them seems, at least in theory, possible. The decision between them would have to appeal to a system-transcendent standard both can agree on. The problem is that that standard itself is not self-justifying, and that launches an infinite regress. So this is a big problem for Hegel, because if there really is no way to tell which of two forms of consciousness is more advanced or has a better standard of truth than the other, then contrary to Hegel, consciousness, spirit, is not on a path of teleological development we can follow and investigate. Instead, consciousness would be dogmatic and stagnant, different forms of knowing, at best shouting at each other across the beyond, insisting on their own greatness. Phenomenology would be finished. Section 84. The solution. The knowing of knowing. So at this point we seem stuck. We need a standard, we need a method by which to begin the investigation and examination of different figurations of consciousness. But either one just doesn't exist, or there's a devastating regress. In section 84, Hegel takes one more deep dive into the abstract determinations of knowing and comes up with a truly original solution that finally provides the standard needed to start the investigation, without running afoul of the problems of the criterion. Hegel's explanation in section 84 only seems cryptic because we haven't started the actual investigation yet, but his point is actually fairly clear. He says, therefore, in what consciousness declares within itself to be the in itself, or the true, we have the standard which consciousness itself sets up to measure its knowing. His point is this: the consciousness or knowing we are investigating is, of course, qua knowing, self-consciousness. It's a classic rationalist move in Western philosophy. First, we see this in Plato. At any rate, what knowing truly is in itself, what its standard of truth is, what it can know by that standard, these are all things on which knowing itself has its own views. A given form of consciousness or knowing has its own self-conception. That's its standard. But just like with people, one's self-conception isn't always one's actual truth. What you think your truth is may or may not be your truth. The way you appear to others, your being for another, can be more revealing of your truth than what you say or think about yourself. Nor need this be inaccessible to you. Self-scrutiny is hard and can be painful. Remember the stations of the cross on the path of consciousness from section 77? But we can learn the truth about ourselves and in that way grow. Now, Hegel puts this in characteristically painful prose, but we can actually unlock it. He says, however, if we designate the essence or the in itself of the object as the concept, by which he means let's call the thing that a given form of knowing thinks is its truth, the thing it thinks it can know, let's call that its concept, or perhaps better, its self-conception. Those are its theoretical commitments. So if that's what the being in itself of that form of knowing is, then we can now turn to the being for another of it. Quote, and in contrast, understand by object the concept insofar as it is object. End quote. So if once again by concept we mean that form of knowing's self-conception, then the concept insofar as it is object is Hegel's admittedly toenail-curling way of saying what by means of that self-conception we can actually learn about an object. Take an example from the start of the book. If you are sense certainty, and your concept is that sensory knowledge is the most immediate and the richest form of knowledge, then this concept, insofar as it is object, is where your theoretical rubber meets the road of reality. It's the object you actually get on that self-conception. And guess what? You find out that sensory knowledge is not the most immediate form of knowing, but the most mediated, and can never give you the richness that you seek. That's your concept insofar as it is object. All right. You can also see why that's the concept insofar as it is for another, because, sorry to break it to you, that's precisely how the world sees you. So finally, if therefore by the abstract determinations of knowing from section 82, we now see that in an investigation of a form of knowing, in a knowing of knowing, that knowing we're investigating can also attain self-knowledge, then we can see how a phenomenological investigation can get off the ground. Quote, then the examining consists in our seeing whether the object corresponds to its concept. End quote. So in this, our knowing of knowing, we don't have to bring along our own standard of truth. We're not importing our own conceptual or theoretical baggage. Quote, we thus do not need to bring standards with us, and in the investigation to apply our ideas and thoughts. End quote. Hegel says, rather, we are lifted above comparing the two and conducting a genuine examination such that while consciousness examines its own self, the only thing that remains to us is purely to look on. And that's why the thing is called a phenomenology. We are mere observers, looking on, letting the experience of watching consciousness proceed on its natural path wash over us. What now remains to be seen is how that experience actually plays out.